asset and often poorly understood and poorly discussed. And then I'll go on to climate change and discuss a little bit about what is going to be, or the potential impact of climate change on groundwater. In the press, there's always lots of comments and hysteria about what climate change might cause to our natural resources and to water resources. Well, we'll just look a little bit, what's the evidence and what could be the impact on these groundwater resources. And then I'll draw some conclusions from that. So, to start off with then, water, poverty reduction and health. I've got 3 pictures up there on the board, and describing different aspects of the problems of poor water supply. So to start off with then, the most obvious one, I suppose, water-related diseases. The top left there, you see some women taking water from a really poor, compromised resource, which they've got to get their drinking water from. And what is a consequence of that? Well, diarrhea and chronic diarrhea is estimated to be, I think, the second major cause of death for infants. I think we've probably seen the statistics that 4 children die every minute due to inadequate water and sanitation, due to water-related diseases. So the health statistics are fairly clear that poor water supply, poor sanitation, poor hygiene lead to a much increase in infant mortality. However, there's also other effects. There's chronic effects. It's not just about the tragedy of so many infants dying due to poor water supply. It's also chronic effects of having that diarrhea when you are so young, in terms of child's development, in terms of their brains developing, in terms of their health and their ongoing health. So there's this kind of hidden cost as well of having such poor water supply and such a high disease burden when you're young. And some people estimate that might be sort of twice the effect of the actual infant mortality itself. There are also issues, though, to do with water-related diseases. Recently we've been trying to publish some stuff in the Lancet about water and its effect on health. And it's very interesting the different levels of evidence that the health community require compared to what we and maybe the environmental sciences use. And I think there's some lessons to draw from that. But one of the issues here is with water supply. Is it all to do with quality? Is it all to do with how pure the water is? Or is it also to do with quantity? And I think there's increasing evidence that it's both. That's important. When there's more water, then there's health outcomes are likely to be better. So that's to do with the first aspect there, health, water and health. But also, with poor water supplies, there's also the opportunity cost. Second picture there on the slide shows women walking, in this instance they're walking for about an hour to a water supply. They have to do that for about 2 or 3 months of the year. So there's a huge opportunity cost there in labour, with particularly women having to go and collect water supplies. And also, if you see that on their heads there is these calabash, which would take about 9 or 10 litres of water. So they're carrying, some people there, loads of 30 to 40 kilograms on their heads. So there's quite an energy cost there. There's also other health implications of that. So this opportunity cost, though, of course, is for children as well. So often children have to collect water, and that means missing out on education. So poor water supply, not just about health, although health is important, it's also about time every day having to collect water for the women, for the children missing out on education. And maternal health as well. These long walks with all the weight on their heads, there's increasing evidence as well that maternal health is affected by poor water supply. Then more positively, actually with better water supply, then you can have choices of using your water more productively. You can actually start to earn a little bit of income, maybe from irrigation, a little bit of irrigation allowing you to sell some surplus to give you some income, and increasing food security yourself. Also economic returns on other things like maybe brewing a little bit of beer or making bricks or things like that. So some evidence that maybe the economic returns on investment in water might be 5 to 50 times the investment made in water supply. So compelling reasons why water and access to water is so important for poverty reduction. So I would say that access to water is slowly beginning to be seen as fundamental to the other development goals. It's not just about access to water and clean water. It's fundamental to some of the other development goals. I thought I'd just put this slide up here to show a little bit of work we were doing, trying to relate infant mortality to access to water. So along the bottom there, you've got the total unserved per country. Up the left, it's the infant mortality per 1,000 live births. And you can see an overall relationship there between them. However, of course, there's other things such as GDP that are so important. So I've coloured it up according to the GDP. So the purple is the very rich countries, and the yellow is the poorest countries. And what we did with our statistics, and of course these are statistics, so they can prove anything, but we did as robust analysis as we felt we could with this data set. And it did seem that independent of GDP, access to water was still a good predictor, an independent predictor of infant, or lack of access to water, as an independent predictor of infant mortality. So that's why access to water, we believe, is so important to poverty reduction. Well, what's all this about groundwater? Why is groundwater so important? Put up another one of my favourite slides here. Very simple slide, really. It just shows the number of dry months in a year. So the blue areas are the areas where there's no dry months in a year. Unsurprising to know that Britain's in that, particularly Scotland, where it's been particularly miserable. But if we look across the whole world, there's some important lessons to be drawn from it. And but just look at Africa just now, which is much of Africa has got many months of the year with no rainfall. So many months of the year with no water coming down from the sky, which means for your water supply, for your drinking water, you need storage. You can't rely on the water coming down from the sky all the time, from rain. You actually need some storage. So looking at that map shows the parts of the world where storage is required for your water supply. India, Africa, many other places. Interesting as well, a lot of the richest countries don't have that problem. Again, I wouldn't want to draw any conclusions from that, but again, it's an interesting thing just to see. So, groundwater is the Earth's natural local storage. So we require storage, and groundwater is a natural local storage. So that's water stored in rocks and gravels under the ground. It's natural and it's local. It can be found in many places. It's good because it can meet dispersed rural demand. You can drill maybe boreholes and wells. You can't drill them everywhere, but you can often find locations where you can get water locally, and you don't have to pipe it in from a river maybe 20 kilometres or 100 kilometres away. It can be quite a local resource. Can be developed cheaply and progressively. Some people would argue about whether it's cheap or not, $4,000 or $5,000 for a borehole. Some people would say that's maybe too expensive. But you can put a borehole in, then you can maybe progress it towards having a pipe supply or something beyond that. One of the really important things about groundwater is it's naturally protected. So because it's below the ground, away from the light, you find that pathogens tend to die off. So once the water's infiltrated into the ground and it's been several months under the ground, then the pathogens have died off, and that water is generally pure from or free from pathogens. There are other issues to do with the chemical quality of the water, but pathogen free. I thought I'd just put this in here, but you're not probably all encountered groundwater often because it's out of sight, and I just put a slide in what is actually groundwater. Down the left-hand side, I've put some cross-sections of, some photos of some cross-sections, some rocks. The top is a gravel, and you can imagine in a gravel, of course, there's lots of pore spaces. Imagine lots of marbles all together. You've got the pore space in there. That's groundwater. That's where the water is stored. The second picture down there, though, is a hard rock. It's like a granite or hard granite. So you don't have pore spaces in there at all. It's not granular. It's solid, but you have fractures running through it. So there's lots of fractures. And the groundwater in that sort of rock is stored in these fractures. And how to develop groundwater. You can dig wells with your hands, with spades probably rather than your hands, but you can dig a well maybe down 10-20 metres to access groundwater, or often it's done by a borehole. So the bottom picture there I've shown you is a drilling rig where you drill down to access that groundwater. So groundwater, water stored under the ground naturally. It's rainfall infiltrating in under the ground. So groundwater, as I've said, I think is really the preeminent water supply for certainly much of Africa. So it's a first option, and possibly with climate change, it may be even contentiously the only option for improved rural water supply. A reliable source of water stored under the ground. It's buffered through droughts. It's good quality. So generally it is a first option for improved rural water supplies, and also there's a growing use of it for small towns and urban supplies. However, as we've been reminded by the joint monitoring report by UNICEF and WHO, 320 million people across Africa still are unserved with any improved water supply, so still reliant on shallow wells or ponds, things that are very poor quality water. So let's move on to climate change and climate change predictions. I mean, there's been a lot of interest, a lot of hot air, a lot of column inches about climate change models recently and how good or how bad they are. I'm not going to go into that kind of detail, but I think it's important for us to recognise, if you want a climate change model, if you want any sort of model that's going to tell you what the groundwater resources are going to be like in 50 years' time in a certain town in northern Nigeria, then you're going to be sadly disappointed. Models will not give you that sort of information. And I think it's good for us to recognise that the global circulation models that can model maybe CO2, so the amount of CO2 into the atmosphere, they can then model a little bit using that data what the temperature rise might be, but then there's a bit of uncertainty with that. So we go from CO2, a bit of uncertainty, temperature, a bit more uncertainty. Then from that we model the precipitation, how much rainfall there might be. Then we get a lot more uncertain when we get to that precipitation. Then for groundwater, we've got to go beyond precipitation and think of evapotranspiration. We get to runoff, and then eventually we get to how much of that might go into the groundwater. So from the first models of CO2, from temperature, precipitation to runoff to groundwater, we're getting pretty uncertain. And you might argue by the time you're actually down there, what you're seeing is noise rather than actually an accurate prediction of what's going on. So I think there needs to be a lot of care in looking at climate change models and looking into and going down in more and more detail to look at a certain area or a certain town. However, I think there's an awful lot of useful lessons we can take from them. One is a consensus that rainfall will be less predictable and more variable. So I think a main message that I certainly take from a lot of the climate change models and output from them is that rainfall is likely to be getting an awful lot more uncertain and less predictable. Coupled with that, of course, we've got the importance of population growth and urbanisation. And I've just put up here, there's a slide that shows the number of good climate stations or weather stations across the world. Blue is high quality data, green's poor, not so good data, orange is pretty dodgy, red's really dodgy. And just look at the climate change, the climate stations for Africa there. So any climate model has got to be based on that sort of data. So again, lots of uncertainty. Now with that growing uncertainty with rainfall and with the climate change predictions, there is an increasing emphasis being put on what I would call the gold reserve of groundwater. If we're not sure what the rain's going to do and what the rivers are going to do, if there's an option, let's go for groundwater. At least we know there's more storage there and it's slightly more buffered through drought. So moving on then to try and draw some lessons of what that increased rainfall variability might have on climate change. Now I'm not using models here. What I think we need to do, or what I've been doing, is looking at current responses of groundwater to current climate. So rather than let's try and predict everything in the future, let's look, how does groundwater behave at the moment during drought? How do water supplies behave during current droughts or current variability? And there's 4 things that I think are important. I'm just going to run through them briefly before I close. One is the resilience of the groundwater resources. Second is the reliability of your actual sources, your boreholes or your wells, or whatever's accessing that water. The next is a rise in demand for groundwater. And the final one is the risks of contamination. And I've got a slide on each. So the resilience of groundwater. Well, groundwater, the amount of groundwater depends on the geology of what the rocks are like and on the rainfall. So there's some key questions here that we need to address. One is, well, what's the actual volume of locally usable groundwater resources? If you're in a community in the middle of Tanzania, well, what is the volume of groundwater resources there? How much are there? Is there any there? Second question would be, well, if you access that groundwater, what are the chemical hazards, the natural chemical hazards? Have we got a Bangladesh here and lots of arsenic? Is there lots of fluoride? Is there going to be any problems? So what are the chemical hazards? Third one we need to address is that groundwater going to be renewable? There might be a big volume there of good quality, but actually maybe we're mining it, and that's something that needs to be known. And how does that groundwater respond to climate and abstraction at the moment? So if we're going to understand the resilience of groundwater to any sort of change, these are the kind of questions we are needing to address. And we've just got a project, I think there's a link to it on the website. I've got a flyer here as well you might have picked up. So just got a project that just started in this last month to just look at all these questions and try and understand for Africa what is going to be the resilience for groundwater. So you can bookmark the web page, and we should be updating on that as we go along. Well, a second issue then is not about the groundwater resources themselves, but about the technology that's accessing that groundwater. So the actual wells or the boreholes or the springs, how reliable are these sources when they come under pressure? Not all water sources are reliable. It's a very important key message to take away. You might have the picture I've got there is of people queuing up for the one reliable water supply in a place in Alaba in Ethiopia. All the other water sources, or many of them had dried up, the shallow ones. It was during a time of drought, but there were several that were still reliable. So getting a reliable water supply means matching the technology to the environmental conditions, getting the right technology to the right geology. Very important. So another thing to consider is a change in demand. Climate change is very likely to be, and also coupled with population growth and urbanization, there's likely to be a much bigger demand for groundwater. And particularly when you look at adaptation strategies, when there are concerns over food security and also individuals or communities having resilient, climate resilient income, they're leading towards a greater push for irrigation. People with irrigation tend to be slightly more resilient. Now, where is that water going to come from? I would argue that would come from groundwater. So there could be a big rise in demand for groundwater. Then we might get some competition between people using groundwater for irrigation and those using it for water supply. And finally, a risk of contamination. If, as some models predict, we get a lot more intense rainfall, it's quite possible that you're going to get links, you're going to get pathogens pushed into the water supply. Water tables might rise at some times, and you might actually get links between latrines, sanitation, good big push for sanitation at the moment, but what happens if pit latrines start getting connected to wells? Then we've got a problem. So I would say we need to consider the risk of contamination and climate change. Right, just in conclusion then, just to draw out what I should have been saying for the last 20 minutes in case I haven't made my message clear. First of all, access to water, a key component in reducing poverty. And I would say that water resource for Africa has got to be groundwater. So access to groundwater, a key component in poverty reduction. I would say climate change are very uncertain, but we can make some conclusions, or we can at least raise some questions. I would say we look at the present response of the current system to pressures, present response to climate and to use, to predict what outcomes might happen. I would say there's going to be an increasing use of groundwater for adaptation strategies. I think here, and crucially, for a no-regrets policy for water supply, I think we need to increase our coverage or access to secure water now. The 320 million people without access to safe water across Africa are the ones most at risk from climate change. So I would say increasing access to improved water supply is something that would be very important to do. And at the bottom there, I've outlined some priorities for research. Of course, this project that we're doing now, resilience to groundwater, very important. But also, we need to look at the reliability of different technologies. We also need to look at what the threats are of contamination, and also to look a little bit more about what the demands might be in the future for secure water. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Alan.